Welcome back, America. You know, when I want to hear some sanity when it comes to so many things, but especially foreign policy, I go to a war veteran, a very accomplished man. I go to Senator Tom Cotton of Arkansas. Senator Cotton, you sit on the Armed Services Committee, the Intelligence Committee, and the Judiciary Committee, but I want to circle back to the Armed Services Committee, your knowledge there, and the Intelligence Committee. Can you explain to the American people, please, why this administration is still funding Iran, still funding Hamas through UNRWA, still funding the PLO directly, while putting its foot on the throat of Israel to try and force it to surrender and then surrender upwards of 30% of its country to its enemy?
Well, Mark, I think from a normal American's perspective, no, you can't explain that. So I think you have to step back and look at the Democratic Party's worldview, driven in part during the Obama presidency. Barack Obama believes deeply that America is the reason for the 4 decades of tensions between Iran and the United States. He believes that we overthrew a democratically elected government in 1953 in Iran. Nothing could be further from the truth. He believes that presidents before him consistently believed the worst about Iran and put undue pressure on them. That if we would just extend, as he said, an open hand, then they would respond. And what did they get? They got a clenched fist throughout the Obama presidency. You got the Iran nuclear deal, which didn't block their path to a bomb, but as Prime Minister Netanyahu said, paved their path to a bomb. And they got billions of dollars of payoffs. Now, that turned the Iran issue in part into a partisan issue because Democrats view that nuclear deal as like the holy grail that's been handed down by President Obama. And that's why Joe Biden went right back to it on the first days in office after President Trump had mounted a very successful pressure campaign against Iran and against its proxies to include killing its terrorist mastermind, Qasem Soleimani. And unfortunately, it continues to this day. There's really, as far as I can tell, not a single bit of difference between our current Iran policy and what it was on October 6th. Even as you have Iran's terrorist proxies in Iraq and Syria and Yemen shooting hundreds of missiles and rockets and one-way attack drones at American citizens and service members. They have not recalibrated at all because they are so deeply invested in the worldview that America is to blame for the tension going back 4 decades between Iran and the United States. That's what's emboldened Iran and emboldened all these proxies to continue to up the pressure on us as opposed to what we should be doing, which is putting the pressure both militarily and through other means on Iran and its proxies.
Is that also at least one of the reasons why they treat Israel the way they treat Israel, that Israel is the reason that the Palestinians are in the situation they're in, as opposed to the PLO, which enriched itself and kept so many Palestinians in a so-called refugee camp, took their money, used it for terrorism and to enrich themselves, and then, of course, the Islamists, whether it's Islamic Jihad or Hamas, all under the Muslim Brotherhood umbrella, where the leaders are billionaires, and of course they're pushing not a two-state solution, but a final solution of Israel, that Israel is the problem and causing all these problems in the Middle East. Is that their mentality, you think?
I think that's part of the reason, Mark. Again, the Democrats have projected American partisan politics onto the region. So if you were opposed to Barack Obama's nuclear deal with Iran in 2015, then you were by definition wearing a red jersey. You were aligned with the Republican Party. And who was doing that more than anyone else? Prime Minister Netanyahu, because he knew that that nuclear deal would lead to a nuclear-armed Iran, which is an existential threat to the Jewish people. But not just Israel, it's also Arab leaders like Mohammed bin Zayed in the United Arab Emirates or Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia who opposed it. What did Joe Biden say about Mohammed bin Salman? That he was going to make him a pariah. Again, they have imposed partisan politics on the Middle East. But I think it goes deeper than just partisan politics. It also goes into their philosophical worldview here in America. Again, in this diversity, equity, inclusion, DEI worldview, they're always aligning what they consider to be the oppressed or the victimized or the minorities. And they've bizarrely superimposed that on the Middle East and specifically on Hamas and Palestinian terrorism. And they view Israel as colonizers and oppressors and Hamas as victims, not the Jewish victims of Hamas who were tortured and mutilated and burned alive on October 7th. So it's a combination of both the Democratic Party partisan views, but also their deeper philosophical views that they projected onto the Middle East and specifically onto Israel. That's one reason why the Democratic Party, up to and including Joe Biden, has such deeply held antagonistic feelings towards Prime Minister Netanyahu and have for a very long time.
So my question to you is this. Have you ever seen an administration like this, perhaps other than Obama, that is literally trying to undo the elected government of another country? They would never do this to any other country but Israel. And I mean, they are actively seeking to destroy his coalition. They're leaking to the press. A rogue operation out of the White House and out of the State Department like this with no real congressional oversight or input. Is this not rather shocking to you?
It is shocking. Unfortunately, it's not the first time the Democrats have done this to Israel, and specifically to Prime Minister Netanyahu. Bill Clinton did it in the 1990s. Barack Obama worked overtime to try to beat Prime Minister Netanyahu in 2015, but it's just more overt and explicit now. I mean, the president and his senior aides in the administration have no scruples whatsoever from running off to the New York Times or the Washington Post and saying anonymously that they think Benjamin Netanyahu is the problem, that he's the obstacle to peace and stability in the Middle East. If they could just bring down his government and elevate a center-left leader who'd be more aligned with our State Department, somehow then peace would break out in the world and you have all these moderate, sensible Palestinian leaders come forward as well. It's all insane. Again, the problem in the Middle East, the threat to peace and stability, it's not Israel, it's not Benjamin Netanyahu, it's Iran and their terrorist proxies like Hamas. And until our government respects the wishes of the people of Israel and the government that they elected a little over a year ago, it's going to be very hard to find a path forward after Israel succeeds in Gaza in destroying Hamas.
When we come back, Senator Cotton, I want to ask you, they keep pushing this two-state solution. Well, what would this other state look like exactly? What powers would it have? How would it be kept off a terrorist list? That is, how would we prevent it from becoming terrorists? We keep talking about this in a superficial way, like we're in some think tank or something. But in reality, in practical terms, on the ground, what would this look like? We'll be right back. Welcome back, America. Senator Tom Cotton, really a two-part question. Number one, how does an administration conduct a foreign policy, which I would call a rogue foreign policy, without inviting the other elected branch of government to participate? We're not talking about commander-in-chief responsibilities here. We're talking about responsibilities that should involve other elected branches of government. I mean, that's why we even have the treaty clause in there. I don't know what they're doing. We all really don't know what they're doing, except that they allow to be leaked. We don't know about their envoy, Malley, who used to be there, why that he yanked his ticket. It's all being done pretty much in secret. That's number one. And number two, this new state they want to create, why would it be any different than a Syria or an Iran or what's happened in Iraq now or Yemen? Why are they so cocksure that they'll be creating a Jeffersonian democracy among people who are surveyed over and over again saying they would vote for Hamas and obliterate the Jews?
Mark, on your first question, I can tell you plenty of Democrats in the Senate are asking the exact same questions that you and I are. They really don't know what Joe Biden and Tony Blinken and Jake Sullivan think they're up to, because they see what's happened over the last 3 years. The world is going up in flames. You had the collapse in Afghanistan, which humiliated America. It emboldened and encouraged Vladimir Putin to go for the jugular in Ukraine. Iran is running wild throughout the Middle East, and China is becoming more and more aggressive towards Taiwan. And time again, Joe Biden turns the other cheek. He appeases, he conciliates, and all that does is embolden aggressors. Just look at what's happened in the Middle East in the last week. We finally struck back at a band of terrorist outlaws in Yemen who have been shooting at merchant ships and even U.S. Navy vessels in the Red Sea. Yet it didn't deter them at all. They're not scared of Joe Biden. Again, a bunch of goat herders in Yemen who just miraculously somehow got anti-ship ballistic missiles and coastal defense radars, all of which technological know-how came from Iran. Yet Joe Biden won't use the kind of decisive force that Donald Trump used in January of 2020 to kill Iran's terrorist mastermind, or that Ronald Reagan used against Iran itself in 1988 when he sank half their navy for mining the Persian Gulf. So many Democrats, like almost all Americans, can't figure out what in the world Joe Biden thinks he's doing when it comes to the world. It just reminds me of what Secretary of Defense Bob Gates once said, that Joe Biden has been wrong on nearly every major foreign policy and national security issue in 40 years. That was 10 years ago now, so I guess you could update it to 50 years. Which brings us to the second question, this obsession with a two-state solution. Again, what would a Palestinian state look like? We don't have to speculate. The people of Gaza elected Hamas to represent them. Hamas has been the functional equivalent of a government in Gaza for 17 years now. And what does Gaza look like? An armed terrorist camp. They took all that money and all that building material that could have gone towards apartment buildings and hospitals and schools, and they used it to build hundreds of miles of tunnels underneath Gaza to protect themselves from retaliation when they launched the kind of brutal attack they did on October 7th. Imagine if it wasn't, though, a quasi-state in Gaza and Judea and Samaria, but an actual state with a military, with an airport and seaports where they could bring in more arms to use against Israel. And remember, too, the Palestinians in Gaza and Judea and Samaria who are attacking Jews, they don't really want a two-state solution either. They want a one-state solution. They want to eliminate Israel from the map. And it is extremely foolish and dangerous for Joe Biden and Tony Blinken in the middle of a shooting war against these outlaw terrorists in Gaza to continue to push for this fantasy of a two-state solution with some mythical moderate Palestinian leadership that has not existed and is not likely to exist anytime soon.
Excellent point. And when Blinken goes to the Middle East and he's meeting with Palestinians, he's meeting with a boss who was a terrorist, who was behind the 1972 Munich attack on the Jews. He funded it. But I notice he never meets with the equivalent of a Martin Luther King or a Gandhi or Nelson Mandela. Who is this great Palestinian leader who wants peace, who's a moderate? Where is he? Who is he? He doesn't exist. And you look at these surveys and you see these votes, and the people have been acculturated to this anti-Semitic viewpoint. And the idea that you're just going to create boundaries and drop people with that background and culture into the boundary, what would stop them from turning into another Iran? What would stop them from turning into another Syria? What would stop them from being a satellite of Iran or China or North Korea? What would stop them, Senator?
Mark, almost nothing would stop them. And that's, again, what Gaza, in effect, has become over 17 years. Remember, there's no occupation in Gaza. There are no Israeli forces or Israeli settlements inside of Gaza before October 7th. The people there were effectively self-governing. And look what Hamas did as the de facto government in Gaza. It would be so much worse if they had an actual state with the actual mechanisms that a state uses, such as the power to tax so they can raise revenue, to buy arms, to kill more Israelis. Again, they don't want a two-state solution. They want a one-state solution. I understand that many people in Washington and Europe want a peace process, but too many Palestinians don't want peace. They want victory. And their definition of victory is driving the Jews into the sea.
And we know this is what they believe because they tell us this is what they believe. They tell us how they would vote, and they tell us what would come. I want to thank you, Senator Cotton, very, very much. God bless you, my friend.
Thank you, Mark.
We'll be right back.